Far in the interior of the country lay an old baronial hall, and in it lived an old proprietor, who had 2 sons, which 2 young men thought themselves too clever by half. They wanted to woo the king's daughter, for the maiden in question had publicly announced that she would choose for her husband the youth who could arrange his words best. So these 2 geniuses prepared themselves a week for the wooing. This was the longest time that could be granted them, but it was enough, for they had had much preparatory information, which is useful. One of them knew the whole Latin dictionary by heart, and 3 whole years of the daily paper of the little town into the bargain, backwards and forwards. The other was deeply read in the corporation laws and knew by heart what every corporation ought to know. And he thought he could talk of affairs of state. And he knew one thing more. He could embroider braces, for he was a light-fingered fellow. "I shall win the princess," they both cried. Their father gave them each a handsome horse. He, who knew the dictionary and newspaper, had a milk-white one. And he, who knew all about the corporation laws and could embroider, had a black steed. Then they rubbed the corners of their mouths with fish oil so that they might become very smooth. All the servants stood below in the courtyard and looked on while they mounted their horses. Just by chance, the 3rd son came up, for there were 3. Though nobody counted the 3rd with his brothers, because he was not so learned as they, and indeed he was generally known as Jack the Dullard. "Hello, where are you going? Why do you have on your Sunday clothes?" asked Jack. "We're going to the king's court as suitors to the king's daughter. Don't you know the announcement that has been made all through the country?" And then they told him all about it. "My word, I'll be in it too," cried Jack the Dullard. And his 2 brothers burst out laughing at him and rode away. I must have a horse too. I do feel so desperately inclined to marry. If she accepts me, she accepts me. And if she won't have me, I'll have her, but she shall be mine. "Don't talk nonsense. You shall have no horse from me. You don't know how to speak. You can't arrange your words. Your brothers are very different fellows from you." "Well, if I can't have a horse, I'll take the billy goat who belongs to me, and he can carry me very well." And so said, so done. He mounted the billy goat, pressed his heels into its sides, and galloped down the high street like a hurricane. Hi-ho, that was a ride! "Tally-ho! Here I come!" And he sang till his voice echoed. But his brothers rode slowly on in advance of him, They spoke not a word, for they were thinking about the fine extempore speeches they would have to bring out, and these had to be cleverly prepared beforehand. "Tell-a-ho!" shouted Jack the Dullard. "Here am I! Look what I found on the high road!" And he showed them what it was, and it was a dead crow. "Dullard!" exclaimed the brothers. "What are you going to do with that? With the crow? Why, I'm going to give it to the princess." "Yes, do so," said they, and they laughed and rode on. "Tally-ho! Here I am again! Just see what I found now! You don't find that on the high road every day." And the brothers turned round to see what he could have found now. "Dullard!" they cried. "That's only an old wooden shoe, and the upper part is missing into the bargain. Are you going to give that to the princess as well?" "Most certainly I shall," replied Jack the Dullard, and again the brothers laughed and rode on, and thus they got far in advance of him. "Tally-ho!" And there was Jack the Dullard again. "It's getting better and better," he cried. "Hooray! It's quite fabulous." "What have you found this time?" inquired the brothers. "Oh," said Jack the Dullard, "I can hardly tell you. How glad the princess will be." "Bah!" said the brothers. "That's nothing but clay out of the ditch." "Yes, certainly it is," said Jack the Dullard, "and clay of the finest sort. See, it is so wet it runs through one's fingers." And then he filled his pockets. But his brothers galloped on till the sparks flew, and consequently they arrived a full hour earlier at the town gate before Jack. Now at the gate each suitor was provided with a number, and all were placed in rows immediately on their arrival, 6 in each row, and so closely packed together that they could not move their arms. And that was a wise arrangement, for they would certainly have come to blows had they been able, merely because one of them stood before the other. All the inhabitants of the country round about stood in great crowds around the castle, just to see the princess receive the suitors, and as each stepped into the hall, his power of speech seemed to desert him. "He is of no use," the princess would say. "Away with him." At last the turn came for that brother who knew the dictionary. But he didn't know it now. He had absolutely forgotten it altogether, and the board seemed to re-echo with his footsteps, and the ceiling of the hall was made of looking glass, so that he saw himself standing on his head, and at the window stood 3 clerks and a head clerk, and every one of them was writing down every single word that was uttered, so that it might be printed in the newspapers and sold for a penny at the street corners. It was a terrible ordeal. And they had, moreover, made such a fire in the stove that the room seemed quite red hot. "Phew! It's dreadfully hot in here," observed the first brother. "Yes, it's because my father's going to roast young pullets today." Bah! There he stood like a bar lamb. He had not been prepared for a speech of this kind and had not a word to say, though he intended to say something witty. Bah! "He is of no use," said the princess. "Away with him." And so he was obliged to go. And now the second brother came in. "It's terribly warm in here," he observed. "Yes, we're roasting pullets today," replied the princess. What? And all the clerks wrote down, What? "He is of no use," said the princess. "Away!" Now came Jack the Dullard. He rode his goat into the hall. "It's very hot in here," he said. "Yes, because I'm roasting young pullets," replied the princess. "Ah, that's lucky," exclaimed Jack the Dullard. "I suppose you'll let me roast my crow then?" "With the greatest pleasure," said the princess. "But have you anything you can roast it in? For I have neither pot nor pan." "Certainly I have," said Jack. "Here's a cooking utensil with a tin handle." And then he brought out the old wooden shoe and put the crow into it. "Well, that is a wonderful dish," said the princess. "But what shall we do for the sauce?" "Oh, I have that in my pocket," said Jack. "I have so much of it that I can afford to throw some away." And then he poured some of the clay out of his pocket. "I like that," said the princess. "You can give an answer, and you have something to say for yourself, and so you shall be my husband. But are you aware that every word we speak is being taken down and will be published in the paper tomorrow? Look yonder, and you will see in every window 3 clerks and a head clerk. And the old head clerk is the worst of all, for he can't understand anything." But she only said this to frighten him. And all the clerks spurted a blot out of his pen onto the floor. "Oh, those are the gentlemen, are they?" said Jack. "Then I will give the best I have to the head clerk." And then he turned out his pockets and flung the wet clay full in the head clerk's face. "That was very cleverly done," observed the princess. "I could not have done that, but I shall learn in time." And then Jack was made a king, and received a crown and a wife, and sat upon a throne. And this report we have wet from the press of the head clerk, but he is not to be depended upon. Tally-ho! Here I am! A crow, a clog, and some sludge. Sometimes that is all you need to force your way into a heart.